Today's lesson is going to be on fractions and decimals and how we graph them on number lines. So here's a number line of integers, positive integers up to 10 and the negative integers up to negative 10. So a fraction is less than a whole number. So if I had the fraction 1/2, half is not a whole. It is less than 1. It's somewhere in between 0 and 1. And a half means halfway. So that one's pretty easy to plot. I go halfway in between 0 and 1, and I can plot a dot. And that is a half. We have another fraction. What about if I had the fraction 2.5? Now I can add a whole number to a half. I can add 2, and now I have 2.5. So to graph that one, I would go to the whole number 2, but this time I'm going to add just a half more. And you notice when I add that half more, I'm not quite to 3. So 2.5 is less than 3. This half means it's not quite a whole. It's halfway, 2.5 to 3. Okay? And in between each of these whole numbers are fractions. So let's blow up this number line. And let's put the 0 here. And we'll put 1 here. And we will put the negative 1 over here. So from 0 to 1 are fractions that are less than a whole. So if I was to plot that half, I would put that half about right there. That is a half. There are other fractions that you really should memorize and know where they are on the number line. For example, 1/4. 1/4 means I'm separating from 0 to 1 into 4 sections. So 1/4 would be about right there. 3/4 is another one you should know, and that would be separating from 0 to 1 into fourths and counting where the third of those fourths would be. So 3/4 would be right there, since I divided from 0 to 1 into 4 parts. 1, 2, 3, and then 4/4 is another way of saying a whole number, which is 1. Now each of these fractions has a decimal that correlates to it, which means we can turn these fractions into decimals. Now it's the same way we did that when we checked our scores on our quiz. So if you don't have a calculator, go ahead and pause right now and get your calculator. Okay, let's take the 1/4. Remember we said 1, and then the fraction bar means divided by 4. So on your calculators, 1 divided by 4, and you should come up with the decimal 0.25. 0.25 is another way of saying 1/4. And that is something you should memorize. You should just know when you see 0.25, that's 1/4. Now a half you probably already know. But still, take your calculator, 1 divided by 2, and you're going to get 0.5. And 0.5 or 0.5 is another way of saying a half. And lastly, we have 3/4. So go ahead, plug that into your calculator. 3 divided by 4, and you get 0.75. And 0.75 is another way of saying 3/4. And if you put 4 divided by 4, 4/4, you're going to come up with 1. Okay, so these are fractions and their decimal that you really should memorize. So if you don't have these down in your notes, please take the time to write that now so that you know what each of these fractions and decimals are. All right, so a rational number is any number that can be written as a fraction. And there goes that line again, as a fraction, okay? So all fractions are rational numbers because they're written as a fraction. So numbers like 6/7, that's a rational number, half, any fraction's a rational number. Well, what about whole numbers? What about 3? What about 27? Are they rational numbers? Well, absolutely they are, because hopefully you remember, all whole numbers actually have a 1 underneath them. We just don't write it. So a 3, another way of writing a 3 is 3 over 1. So whole numbers have a 1 underneath them. And we could say they're rational numbers because I can write it as a fraction. I can write 27 as a fraction. 27 over 1. It really is as easy as that. So go ahead and show the number 8 as a fraction. 8 over 1. Okay? So, fractions, rational numbers, whole numbers are rational numbers because we can turn them into a fraction. Well, what about decimals? What about that decimal 0.5? Can I write that as a fraction? And you really can't. You just have to remember your place value. All right? Let's take a look at that. So here's our place value, and this should look familiar. Let's forget about that stuff down here. Sorry about that, cut that out. So let's go back to our 0.5. Let's put the decimal here. There are no 1s and there are 5/10, right? 0.5, there's my decimal, and this 5 is in the 10th place. So how would I say that? I would say this is equal to 5/10. Is that a fraction? Yes, it is. So a decimal is also a rational number because I can write it as a fraction, 5/10. And let's talk about simplifying fractions. Let's hope that you remember a little bit about that. I can divide this by 5, and I can divide the denominator by 5, and 5/10 gives me a half. And that's what we said. A half is equal to 0.5. All right, let's go to our 1/4. What do you remember? 1/4. What fraction is that equal to? I hope you said 0.25. Oh, I hope you said it without that big line though. All right, well, let's place our 0.25 on our place value chart. Decimal went away. So I have 0.25. Now the 5 is in the hundredths place. So when I say that, I'm going to, when I read this decimal, I read it as 25, and then I'd say the name that it ends in, hundredths. So 0.25 is equal to 25 hundredths. There's a fraction. We can also simplify this. We say to ourselves, what number can I divide into both of these? And the answer is I can divide them both by 25. Think of it as quarters. So 25 divided by 25 is 1. And 100 divided by 25, think about how many quarters are there in a dollar, and I get 1/4. So 25 hundredths is the same as 1/4. Let's get rid of that. The other decimal that I said that you really should know by heart and memorize was the decimal 0.75. Well, let's put that on our place value chart. 0.75. It ends in the hundredths. So to write that as a fraction, I just read it. 75 hundredths. I just don't like that. And there's the fraction. And that can be simplified as well. We can divide the numerator by 25. Excuse me, by 75, and I get 1. And take that back. I was right the first time. All right, we're going to divide 75 by 25. Apologize. And we get 3. Divide 100 by 25, and I get 4. So 75 hundredths simplifies to 3/4. And we said 3/4. That's all. They are all equal. 75 hundredths equals 3/4, which equals 0.75. All right? All right, so what if we use the chart for fractions that I didn't tell you to memorize, and negative ones? Let's say we have negative 1.9. How do I write that as a fraction? Well, I could still plug it into my place value chart. I have a negative 1, which I can put here. It's in the negative 1's place, my decimal, and then the 9 is in the 10th place. So I just read this. This is negative 1. The decimal means and 9 tenths. 9 tenths. And that's how I change this decimal into what we call a mixed number. Negative 1 and 9 tenths. There's a good number line picture in your book on page 162 in your math book that you can take a look at to give you some more information. So if I was to take this negative 1.9 and you had to graph it, okay, so if I have 0, 1, 2, this is negative 1, negative 2, I would go to negative 1, and then I have to keep going down that number line to 0.9, 9 tenths. 9 tenths. 9 tenths is really close to 10 tenths, isn't it? And 10 tenths is a whole number, which means it's almost to 2. So negative 1 and 9 tenths would be probably about right there. Okay? And that's how we would graph it on a number line. Okay, so to wrap it up, take your pencil and carefully point on this number line where you would plot 1.5. 1 and 5 tenths. If you need more time, pause. So 1 and 5 tenths, I go to the 1. 0.5 we learned is 5 tenths, which is a half, so you should be right here for 1.5. Now, with your pencil carefully, will you point to where negative 2.25 is? You should be at about 2 negative 2 1/4, which is about right there. How'd you do?